All right, President Biden was in Philadelphia earlier today giving a speech at the National Constitution Center, and it was described by CNN and others as a fiery speech calling for election reform in the country. Joining me now to talk more about this is PJ Media Senior Editor Tyler O'Neill. Tyler, welcome back to the program.
Glad to be here, Tony.
I've got another clip I want to play of Mr. Biden as he was making his speech. Play out the other clip we've got there of Mr. Biden.
We're facing the most significant test of our democracy since the Civil War. That's not hyperbole. Since the Civil War. The Confederates back then never breached the Capitol, as insurrectionists did on January the 6th. I'm not saying this to alarm you. I'm saying this because you should be alarmed.
I find that very fascinating, Tyler. What he's done is he's bridged the election reforms that have gone forward in at least 17 states, and he's connected it to the riots at the Capitol on January 6th to say it's the same thing.
Yeah, it's rather unconscionable. I mean, the two are extremely different sides of an issue that is increasingly more complex. I mean, we saw on January 6th these rioters and, largely peaceful, we had a mostly peaceful protest outside the Capitol on January 6th. But of course, there were violent rioters who broke into the Capitol, and many of them were supporters of President Trump, and they wanted Congress to overlook the results of the Electoral College in the 2020 election. And that is, that's unconscionable. And what they did was not to be defended. At the same time, there were legitimate concerns in the 2020 election. And Biden himself even mentioned, he praised the election officials for rushing through these changes to the election that enabled more people to vote during the pandemic. And then he acted as though, those changes should be permanent. And this is the way that the Democrats have been pushing this rhetoric. They're saying, oh, what happened in the 2020 election was amazing. And we want to make sure that this can continue to happen because there were more voters that voted than ever before. Never mind the fact that states sent out ballots and ballot request forms to people who hadn't requested them. Never mind the fact that chain of custody restrictions that used to be held close to the vest and monitored well were not monitored as well in the 2020 election. I'm not saying that the 2020 election should not be relied upon, that the results were not true. I think there are serious concerns that we have. But at the end of the day, the Electoral College made its decision. The key issue that Republicans are pushing in these state legislatures is that we should have election integrity along the same lines as we had before the 2020 election, when the rules were weakened in order to allow more people to vote amid a pandemic. And yet Biden comes out and says, oh no, this is Jim Crow in the 21st century if you dare change these rules from the 2020 election. And then he ratcheted up the rhetoric yet again today. He suggested that because the Texas law has protections for poll watchers, that this would amount to they want to ignore the will of the people if their preferred candidate loses. Right. He had this sentence, which was baffling to me.
Yeah, I heard that, and I'm like, what in the world is he talking about? And he repeated it. He didn't say it just one time, but he repeatedly said, this is about those who count your vote and whether it counts. And he talked about it's all about those that don't like the outcome of the election being able to cancel the election. I mean, where in the world? That's kind of like you can't give water to people standing in line in Georgia. Who's telling him this stuff?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I almost think he's purposefully grasping in order to expand his rhetoric further and further, and almost to have a nod to the people who came forward in that Time article saying that they they secured the election, the 2020 election, the cabal and the shadow campaign pulling the levers behind the scenes in the 2020 election. This isn't a Republican conspiracy theory. This is an article that was published in Time magazine. And organizations like the Center for Tech and Civic Life funneled money into blue areas of the country, boosting turnout that helped Biden prevail.
Right.
And Biden, in the middle of his remarks, said, just like we did in 2020, we have to prepare for 2022. That, I mean, given what happened in the 2020 election and that particular Time magazine article, that's a pretty chilling statement he had there.
It is, and when you look at the fact that you had nearly half the states that have been attempting to or have addressed, more than half the states, to address voting irregularities that came up in the November election, as you said, because there were people within the process that were acting unilaterally in some cases because of the pandemic. You mentioned Mark Zuckerberg, the organization that he funded. They got involved. This had never been a scenario that we had faced before an election in the midst of a pandemic, and so people responded. Now they're going back to do cleanup, saying, you know what, we shouldn't have done it that way. But it's all being dismissed because they're saying, well, there was no voter fraud. There were voting irregularities. And it can't be that half the states got it wrong as they're trying to address these issues that have shaken people's confidence in the election system.
And it's also not the case, like Biden said, and this is the quote that really stood out to me. He said, they're not only targeting people of color, they're targeting voters of all races and backgrounds with a simple target. You did not vote for me.
Right.
And that's like, okay, so where in the Texas bill does he get the slightest inkling of anything like this? He doesn't. But he is grasping at straws in order to suggest that the Republic is doomed and push his federal takeover of elections.
Right. The only thing I see in the Texas law that I probably would disagree with, and I guess I'd have to listen to their rationale for it, is to eliminate drive-through voting, where you can drive through, show a picture ID, and drop your ballot off. I'm not sure why they're prohibiting that, but everything else in that looks very reasonable to me. Voter ID laws, the fact that you got to have ID, and they're restricting the vote by mail or fraud by mail that can be done. So I don't see anything in this. But what I found interesting in it, as he was attacking Texas, that he also made reference to, H.R. 1, S1, that the Senate Republicans blocked it. And he said, let's see if I got the quote here. He accused the Republicans of shirking the truth and responsibility for upholding the Constitution. They wouldn't vote on this. And he says, have you no shame? Well, at the same time, he's welcoming the Democrats from Texas to Washington, D.C., that's become a sanctuary city for those who are performing malfeasance in office because they don't want to vote on election reform measures in Texas. I mean, how do they say this stuff with a straight face?
Yeah, I mean, it's even worse than that. So Biden comes out and says, oh, we need to pass H.R. 1 to save the Republic. And then in the same breath, he praises Merrick Garland for bringing a legal challenge against Georgia's law, which, by the way, is far less restrictive than the laws in Biden's home state of Delaware. When is the Delaware lawsuit, I wonder? And when will the Department of Justice's Voting Rights Division decide to target the blue states that have more restrictive laws than Georgia has that may, I haven't looked at the specifics, but may also impact minorities more greatly than the Georgia law? It's like, it's clear that this is a political push that Biden is making hay out of the Capitol riot, out of the situations with Trump's rhetoric after the election, and out of the fact that, there were irregularities in the 2020 election, and they need to be taken seriously.
Right.
But Biden continues to say, he's like, oh, this election was the most perfect election ever, partially because I won. And by the way, we need to continue the same things that happened in the last election. All your concerns about election integrity are just smokescreens for Trump to say that he really won. And it's like, no, there's a lot more to it.
So Tyler, last question for you. Is this being driven by the left wing of his party, saying he's not doing enough to ram through H.R. 1?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think part of it is the pressure on the party. Part of it is from himself. I think Biden himself sees himself as the promise to the progressive left that even Barack Obama failed to be. And so we've seen Biden pushing issues that we never would have thought he would. Like Joe Biden in the Senate was a firm supporter of the Hyde Amendment for decades. Now he's suddenly entirely against it.
Right.
And more than that, he wants to force Catholic hospitals to perform transgender surgery in violation of the Hippocratic Oath. I mean, this is the Joe Biden we're dealing with. He named the first openly transgender Assistant Secretary of Health and got this guy through the Senate. And, you know, this is the kind of thing that Obama wouldn't have tried.
Yeah, well, and it was Joe Biden that pushed Barack Obama to endorse same-sex marriage. So you're right. He has his own agenda here, clearly. Tyler O'Neill, thanks so much for joining us. Always great to talk with you.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks, Tony.